Well, good evening, everybody. I'm Tim Reeves, the Deputy Director, and I'm glad you could all come out and visit us tonight. I have a few notes that they always write down for me, so I won't forget anything. First is to thank you for joining us at this At Ease program, as we call these Tuesday night events now. They've really become popular, and we look to just growing the program in the future. Please silence your cell phones, since we will be being taped by EagleCom, and want to thank them for coming out tonight. Also want to thank the Eisenhower Foundation for making all these programs possible and available for all of our visitors to enjoy. And now I would like to finally introduce our speaker, Peter Shinkle. Peter has been working on this project for a number of years, which he'll tell you about. So he's spent a lot of time in Abilene and a lot of time speaking with our staff. He worked for 19 years as a reporter for various news outlets, including most recently the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, where he covered the federal court system and also wrote investigative stories on subjects ranging from improper disposal of radioactive waste to the political influence of the payday loan industry, among other very interesting subjects. Peter is also the great-nephew of Robert Cutler, one of President Eisenhower's closest advisors, whom you'll hear about in just a minute. And after learning that his Uncle Bobby was gay during a family vacation, Peter began a 12-year journey exploring Ike's mystery man, including extensive research, as I said, at the archives here in Abilene. And in case you don't already own a copy of Ike's Mystery Man, we'll have them available in the gift shop, and Peter will be happy to sign them for you. And so please welcome Peter Shinkle.
Thank you, Tim, for that very kind introduction. Robert Cutler, known to many simply as Bobby, was a profoundly loyal supporter of Dwight D. Eisenhower. After getting to know Ike at the end of the war, Bobby later helped him win the Republican nomination and then worked on Ike's presidential campaign in 1952, riding with him on the Eisenhower Special Campaign train. Bobby went on to reform the National Security Council for Ike, and Ike appointed him as the first National Security Advisor in early 1953. Over the 12-year period that I wrote Ike's Mystery Man, a biography of Robert Cutler, I tried to understand the complexities and mysteries of Bobby's work with Ike. Time and again, I visited this library and worked with its extremely professional and capable staff of archivists. And so it is a great honor to appear now to talk about the book that resulted from those efforts with the assistance of your talented staff here. Before I start, I just want to say thank you very much for all of your help. It was back in the summer of 2006 that I first heard that Bobby Cutler was gay. While vacationing in Rhode Island, I was sitting on an outdoor deck with my mother and aunt, Judith Cutler Shinkle and Patricia Cutler Warner. When I asked them some questions about Bobby, they both said he was gay. I was shocked. Bobby was a close friend and advisor to President Eisenhower in the 1950s, an era in which homosexuality was widely condemned. It was viewed as criminal, a disease, a dangerous sign of subversion, and of course, kept in the closet. Could it be true that a top aide to Ike was gay? Bobby was a lifelong bachelor. He died in 1974, and I never met him. After I was let in on this family secret, the first thing I did was to read his autobiography, published in 1965, but it stated nothing explicitly about sexual orientation. But it dropped hints that nurtured my suspicion that there was truth to this story. For one thing, it revealed Bobby's delight in cross-dressing. For another, it said he had one failed romance with a woman in the late 1920s, followed by a series of very close attachments to men. I interviewed Cutler family members and sought out those of Bobby's acquaintances who were still alive. They confirmed my mother's and aunt's account, and the story began to emerge. Born in 1895 in Boston, Bobby grew up in a Republican family. He was a devotee of Teddy Roosevelt, a fierce patriot, a believer in military service to his country, and a fervent Christian. He published the first of his 2 novels the year after he graduated from Harvard. He served in the Army in World War I and later had a successful career practicing law, which he left to serve in the War Department during World War II. Because of his outstanding service in managing soldier voting during the presidential election of 1944, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal. He ended the war with the rank of Brigadier General. I'll show you a few images here of Bobby. This is Bobby as a 2-year-old in Brookline, just outside of Boston. Bobby in his outfit for a school dramatic production. This is a file that emerged during the course of my research. Bobby's on the left holding the hat. This is about age 18. The young man on the right, I'm sorry to say, I could never identify, despite spending lots of time trying to figure that out. This is Bobby during military training at the Plattsburgh Barracks in New York in 1917. He's the first, here on the right, on the first row. After returning from the First World War, in which he spent mostly as a military policeman, never saw direct combat. He attended Harvard Law School and was at the top of his class. Here he is on the, as an editor of the Law Review. This is Bobby with his 4 brothers. Oops, excuse me. Their father, George Cutler, is here. Elliot Cutler, George Cutler Jr., John Cutler, my grandfather, and Roger Cutler. All 5 brothers went to Harvard. While practicing law in Boston, Bobby became involved in civic activities. He was particularly involved in something called the Community Chest, basically an umbrella organization for civic community groups, now often called the United Way. In doing that, he became involved with other figures in politics in Boston. Here he's seated with a Democrat who became a good friend of his, Maurice Tobin, the mayor of Boston. In 1940, Maurice asked Bobby to become the corporation counsel, the chief lawyer for the city of Boston. And this began Bobby's career as a Republican who could work across the aisle with Democrats to solve problems and to advance civic improvement. Here you see Bobby on a cruise in the Caribbean. In case you couldn't find him, he's the one with the parasol. On the right is his very dear friend, Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., U.S. Senator, Republican U.S. Senator from Massachusetts. To the left of Bobby is his very dear friend, Chandler Bigelow, who doesn't look very amused with the setting at all. Apparently it's a costume party. This is during the Caribbean cruise, and Senator Lodge's wife and her sister are dressed as sailors. And here is Secretary of War Henry Stimson on the left, awarding Bobby the Distinguished Service Medal in late 1945. Now, after the Second World War, Bobby returned to Boston, and he was named president of Old Colony Trust Company, then the largest trust company outside of New York. He was known for his intense work ethic. Some employees referred to his office, perhaps not lovingly, as Hurricane Corner. At the end of the war, Bobby had gotten to know General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the brilliant American general who led the Allied forces in the D-Day invasion and on to victory over the Nazis. In 1952, Bobby worked with his good friend Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. and others to help Ike win the Republican presidential nomination. After Ike was nominated, Ike asked Bobby to join him on his campaign train to write speeches and help with other matters. Bobby gladly accepted. He brought to this work an unusual combination of political acumen, a knowledge of military and intelligence matters, and perhaps most importantly, a sparkling wit, which could at times turn bawdy and could break the tension that Ike felt over politics. After Ike won the election of 1952, he named Bobby his top national security aide. Here are a few scenes from the campaign. This is Ike and Bobby in the rear car of the campaign train where Ike and Mamie resided. You can see they're working over some kind of document. Ike's table is stocked with cigarettes. And Bobby seems to be following what Ike is reading or saying quite closely. Here are Ike on the left and Mamie and Bobby coming down some steps after attending church during the campaign in the fall of '52. They're at Columbia University in New York, where, of course, Ike had previously been president of the university and still maintained an apartment and often returned there as a base of operations. And here's another photo of Ike and Bobby over a pile of papers discussing things, again, during the campaign. Now, I'd like to show you a video clip from the campaign train provided by the library. I'm going to pause that for just a second. You heard the name mentioned there, Steve Benedict, one of the young men working on the campaign. Later will play into the story I'm going to tell you tonight. Lastly, we have a slide showing Ike traveling through Harvard Square in Cambridge, Mass., just outside Harvard University. You see Bobby is to the right of Ike, and on the left is U.S. Representative Christian Herter, who was running in that race to become governor of Massachusetts. Governor Herter was elected and later would join the administration and eventually serve after John Foster Dulles' death as Secretary of State. After the election of 1952, Bobby moved to Washington and took up residence in a boarding house for bachelors that had been begun by aides to Teddy Roosevelt, close to the White House. Bobby became a member of a nearby club, the Metropolitan Club, and often ate there and dropped in for a drink after a long day of work at the White House. From the start of the administration, Bobby insisted on remaining in the background. He adamantly refused to speak to the press on or off the record. And yet he was a man who knew many of the highest secrets and who was known to be completely comfortable with Ike and his cabinet members. This would eventually result in the Saturday Evening Post dubbing him the mystery man of the White House, hence the title of my book. 2 months after Ike's inauguration in January 1953, Bobby proposed a reform of the National Security Council, which had been largely neglected by President Truman. In fact, Ike and Bobby on the campaign train had turned the National Security Council into a campaign issue, with Ike criticizing Truman's handling of the National Security Council. Bobby envisioned the National Security Council as the preeminent tool for the president to set national security policy. Bobby also devised a new position for a person who would set the agenda for the NSC meetings and also brief the president on the issues to come before those meetings. Just one day after Bobby delivered his plan to Ike in March 1953, Ike approved it. A few days later, Ike named Bobby to the new post, which is now called National Security Advisor. In his new role, Bobby urged greater openness with the American public about the nuclear arms race, which led directly to Ike's Atoms for Peace speech in the United Nations in December 1953, which in turn led to the creation of the International Atomic Energy Agency, the world's chief anti-nuclear proliferation body. However, this is just one case where Bobby took an advocacy role, but Bobby is far better known as the originator of the role of being an honest broker, so that all other federal agencies who produce intelligence can come to the National Security Council and present their views to the president regarding national security policy. Other national security advisors would later shift into a more advocacy, one-sided sort of role. Bobby is more famous as embodying the honest broker. Here I'm going to show you a picture from that same article in the Saturday Evening Post where Bobby was dubbed the mystery man of the White House. Here you see him in Quantico, Virginia, poolside, evidently in the summer of 1953. You see Budget Director Joe Dodge here, and Treasury Secretary George Humphrey, Defense Secretary Charles Wilson, Attorney General Brownell, and Bobby, apparently expounding on some point, drawing everybody's attention. It's just a reflection of the collegiality that Bobby brought to the administration. And this is a rather interesting picture. Bobby included this in his autobiography. This picture hung outside the Oval Office. It shows Bobby bicycling along the Potomac River on December 3rd, 1953. It bore a caption which reads, "It's not young Lochinvar, of course, but Bobby on his iron horse." Lochinvar is a figure from a ballad by Sir Walter Scott. As National Security Advisor, Bobby worked regularly with FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover was rumored to be gay, and yet he was also leading a vigorous campaign to drive what were then called sexual perverts out of the federal government. Senator Joseph McCarthy, also rumored to be gay, had picked up this campaign against sexual perverts and twinned it with his hunt for communists in the federal government. Now, Ike had campaigned with McCarthy, and he had made a promise to drive subversives out of the U.S. government. And in that end goal, they were alike, Ike and McCarthy. But Ike made it abundantly clear, repeatedly, publicly, that he did not agree with Joe McCarthy's methods. Yet, Ike also wanted the support of McCarthy and his voters. Now, in early 1953, Bobby recommended that Ike adopt security rules for federal employees that had been drafted under President Truman. Those rules included a criteria for sexual perversion that had the effect of launching a ban on homosexuals in the federal government. This ban would have a terrible effect, causing by one estimate as many as 10,000 gays to be fired. I call this ban peculiar because Ike himself seemed quite sympathetic to homosexuals, not inclined to persecute them. The historical record reveals no evidence that either Bobby or Ike vigorously advocated a campaign against so-called sexual perverts for political advantage like McCarthy did. Yet it does appear that Ike issued his security rules, Executive Order 10450, primarily to fulfill his campaign promise, which he made in part to win the support of McCarthy and his supporters to rid the government of subversives. For Bobby's part, his role was chiefly to steer Ike to the security rules drafted under President Truman that contained the provision regarding sexual perversion. It is also true that Bobby, Ike, and others did not object as they reviewed the proposed security rules before Ike signed them on April 27, 1953. Once the rules were issued, investigators in federal agencies, including a close ally of McCarthy's, whom Foster Dulles had made chief of security at the State Department, beat the drum to spur a hunt for homosexuals. The result is the Lavender Scare. As the numbers of fired homosexuals rose, McCarthy seized on that number as proof of subversives in the federal government. Now, 4 years later, in Ike's second term, in April 1957, when three homosexuals among the White House staff were exposed. One of these men, Joseph Halter, told the Secret Service that Bobby Cutler was a homosexual. Halter also revealed that he had seen a secret 1953 document stating that English Foreign Minister Anthony Eden was a homosexual. Ike's chief of staff, Sherman Adams, a good friend of Bobby's, by the way, feared a security breach and notified J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover rushed to the White House to investigate the matter. And later that day, he called Bobby to tell him that the document that Halter had seen could only be a letter that he, Hoover, had sent to Bobby 4 years earlier, alleging that Eden was a homosexual. Hoover described his call to Bobby in a memo he sent to his own extremely close male companion, Associate FBI Director Clyde Tolson, and two other top officials. I'll read a little bit of the book from that. The fact that the 1953 letter had been sent to Bobby appeared to put Bobby's own conduct in question. Had he shown Hoover's letter to Halter? If Bobby did show it to him, why and when? If Bobby did not show the letter to Halter, how had Halter seen it? Why did Halter think Bobby was a homosexual? And why did he think, as he had alleged, that continuing to work with Bobby would lead to an embarrassment for the White House? These questions would have been fairly logical to ask. Yet Hoover's memo ends abruptly without mention of further investigative steps. For years, Hoover had positioned himself as vigilant in ferreting out sex deviants from the federal government. Yet there is no documentary evidence he pursued Bobby further. It is possible to speculate that Hoover decided to overlook the allegations of homosexuality against Bobby because Bobby was a general, an unquestionably loyal American, a devout Christian, a vigorous anti-communist, and a key member of Eisenhower's inner circle. Perhaps most significantly, an investigation of Bobby would likely have caused severe damage to Hoover's relationship with Eisenhower. Hoover also may have recognized in Bobby a kindred soul, a powerful aging bachelor who had intense relationships with men. Each was vulnerable to and could ill afford an allegation of homosexuality levied against him publicly. Ultimately, Hoover may have rushed to make that call to Bobby with two competing motives. First, to investigate the case and gain leverage over Bobby, and second, to protect Bobby as a friend and ally. Hoover himself may not have known which of these two competing motives he would give free rein to later. Whatever his reasons, Hoover soon dropped his probe of Bobby's handling of the Eden letter and Halter's allegations that Bobby was gay. There are no additional investigative reports in Hoover's official and confidential file on the matter, titled simply White House Employees, Homosexuals. On April 19, Hoover noted that General Goodpaster asked the FBI to return the Secret Service investigative report to the White House. Hoover, however, had a photostat copy of the Secret Service report placed in his confidential White House Employees, Homosexuals file. A few weeks later, in a memo to Tolson and other agents, Hoover said he had informed the Attorney General that, quote, our investigation had not in any way substantiated the original allegations against General Cutler. Now let me take you back to the fall of 1952, when Bobby was working for Ike on the Eisenhower Special, as the campaign train was known. There, Bobby met a young speechwriter named Stephen Benedict, and they became good friends. After Ike's election, Steve, who was secretly gay, moved into a White House staff post and recommended that Bobby hire Steve's former lover, a former Navy intelligence officer named Skip Coons, on the staff of the NSC. Skip, born in New Jersey in 1926, attended Princeton, but after 2 years of college went to work in the Office of Naval Intelligence to join the war effort in February 1945. He was assigned to the Navy Language School in Boulder, Colorado, to learn Russian, and then returned to the Office of Naval Intelligence in Washington, and was then assigned to the Navy's 7th Fleet, based in Tsingtao, China. Skip was soon at the center of a conflict with the Soviet Union at the dawn of the Cold War. In December 1946, the United States sent a vessel to the port of Dairen, China. The objective was to make the point that Dairen was supposed to be an open port under the terms of the Yalta Accords. Skip was assigned as the vessel's intelligence officer. But the Soviet Army, then helping Mao's communist forces battle the nationalists for control of China, demanded that the ship leave the port after just 48 hours. Skip, just 20 years old at the time, translated a Russian officer barking an ultimatum at the American Navy commander. The American vessel, which had been disarmed prior to the voyage precisely to avoid an armed conflict, had no choice but to leave the port. A story about the tense conflict ran on the front page of the New York Times 4 days later. The Soviets denied any ultimatum had been issued, and the Truman administration also played down the confrontation. But Navy officials backed up the press account and backed up Skip Koons' translation. And an editorial in the Times criticized the Truman administration for failing to stand up to the Soviets. Here are a few pictures. Here's Steve Benedict as he looked when he was living with Skip Koons in southern France in 1950 and 51 on the left. That's in Caen, France. And on the right, looking rather more buttoned up in his White House Directory staff photo. Here's Skip in his naval uniform. And here's the vessel, the LCI 1090, that went to the port of Dairen. Skip is looking rather dashing, if I say so, in a Navy jacket with his white scarf. Kind of stands out in the crowd there. This picture actually, quite interestingly, after this incident, the U.S. Navy barred reporters from its vessels in the China theater. And this photograph was never published. Instead, it sat in the Life magazine archives, where I retrieved it a few years ago. None of the photographs of the conflict and the vessel's visit to Dairen were ever published. Now, 7 years after this incident, in 1953, sorry to be jumping around with the chronology here, but bear with me if you will. Now I'm back up to 1953, early in the days of the administration. Skip was working for a CIA front called AMCOMLIB, setting up anti-communist radio broadcasts in Russian and other languages into the Soviet Union. He was working in Munich, Germany. After Steve introduced Skip to Bobby, Bobby swiftly hired Skip to join the staff of the NSC. Together, Bobby and Skip would work on some of the most sensitive national security matters in the NSC. Along the way, Bobby developed passionate feelings for Skip. We know this because after my mother revealed Bobby's secret to me, I went to the Eisenhower Presidential Library here in Abilene, and the staff kindly introduced me to Stephen Benedict. I met Steve for the first time in July of 2008, when Steve was 81 and living in upstate New York. After concluding he could trust me with a treasure he had been safekeeping, he gave me Bobby Cutler's 6-volume diary, which includes Bobby's expressions of love for Skip. The diary revealed that Bobby had become extremely fond of Skip almost from the moment Bobby hired him. But Bobby's passion for Skip truly blossomed in July of 1957. The rush of love is described in chapter 18, which is entitled, "The Greatest Adventure of My Life." I'll read you a portion. On Saturday night, July 13, 1957, Bobby and Skip went out to see a movie. And after the show, Skip drove Bobby home in his Thunderbird. Skip pulled the black convertible up in front of the family, Bobby's residence a few blocks from the White House. The stark age difference between the two men, Bobby was 62 and Skip was 31, did not impede the sharing of affection. The moment came rushing back to Bobby as he poured out his feelings of love for Skip in a secret diary. Reading from the diary now. He brought me home from a movie in the Thunderbird and went to say goodnight outside number 1718 H Street, the address of his residence. I took his hand, our fingers for a moment interlaced. It was at that moment the greatest adventure of my life began, the best, the purest, the most penetrating emotion I ever knew. God keep this spirit always so, wearing his cross, thinking of his happiness, remembering every minute of his serenity and serious charm, wanting nothing of life but to have a part of his life. By the time Bobby wrote that glowing diary entry a year later, he was wearing a gold cross that Skip had given him. In another diary entry, he wrote, "The brilliant light of my love for him throws all the rest of this world in shadow." Now, here are a few more pictures. That's Skip behind the wheel of his convertible in a residence that he shared with Steve in Alexandria, Virginia. It's about 8 miles outside of Washington, D.C., far from the prying eyes of the nation's capital. The gentleman here is a younger man, another man who was a lover of Skip's at the time, Gaylord Hofteaser. I did not make that up. Skip and Gaylord would also later become very close to Bobby. But in July of 1957, not long after they went to that movie, and Bobby's heart was set aflutter, they went to a mansion in Georgetown, owned by Harvard University, called Dumbarton Oaks. And Dumbarton Oaks has a swimming pool, and I guess they went for a swim that day. And somebody took this picture. I'd never quite figure out who took the picture, but that's Bobby on the left and Skip. In May of 1958, by which time Skip had moved to a position in the U.S. Embassy in Paris, Bobby traveled to visit Skip in Paris, and they went on to spend some days in Venice. And this is a picture of Bobby in St. Mark's Square in Venice from that trip with Skip. Bobby taped this image into the diary. Now, Bobby resigned from his post at the NSC in July of 1958, citing, among other things, his exhaustion from performing the role of National Security Advisor. Skip, meanwhile, as I noted, had taken a position with the U.S. Information Agency at the embassy in Paris. In August 1958, Bobby traveled to Paris to be with Skip again, and the two men traveled to Normandy. They visited the Normandy American Cemetery and Memorial, where soldiers who died in the D-Day landing are buried in a beautiful setting along the Normandy coast. Here, Bobby wrote a postcard to Ike, telling of his and Skip's visit. Here you see the card, which is in the files here in the library. I love the address, too. The President, the White House, Washington, D.C. It got there because it's here, and Ike responded. So, August 23, Dear Mr. President, Skip and I drove over in his car to see these areas of your great landing and to pay our respects. It is very impressive and interesting that the large crowds of visitors on Saturday were mostly French. Yours, Bobby. The other side of the card is quite intriguing. This is a slightly homoerotic sculpture, if I do say so. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that, without any disrespect to our dead heroes in the cemetery. But this is a sculpture called The Spirit of American Youth Rising from the Waves by Donald Ledoux. So that card is interesting because it suggests that Bobby was quite open with Ike about his fondness for Skip. However, I've got to say that there is no evidence that that Skip actually knew Bobby was gay or considered him to be gay. It is simply This is not an issue that is documented or commented on anywhere. However, given the amount of time that the two men spent together and the closeness of their friendship, I think it's probably very likely that Ike had his suspicions. But again, there's no evidence to nail that down. Now, a short while later, after this trip, Skip and Steve and their friend Gaylord Hofteaser all fell under an investigation for homosexuality under Executive Order 10450. Steve lied bluntly to a U.S. Information Agency investigator. But the investigation left the men horrified and anxious. And I'd like to read you a little segment about that. Steve alerted Skip to the investigation using the veiled language that the two men had mastered over the years. Skip wrote back on October 11, 1958, assuring him that he was receiving the important communications. I have received all your letters. Your promptness in writing them, your details are greatly appreciated. I have studied them thoroughly. He told Steve to send innocuous letters to his apartment, but to take secretive measures for letters with something out of the ordinary by sending them to his friend Patrice Astier. Quote, do not put any return address on outside envelope, which should be addressed to Patrice. Inside envelope marked for Skip, close quote. He also warned that sending letters to him at the American Embassy was not reliable. Then the patriotic former intelligence officer, who, by the way, all these years had continued to be a naval attaché and go through naval reserve officer and continued to go through regular training to maintain that status, and NSC staffer unburdened himself of the agony the investigation was causing him. Some days are gloomier than others, of course. I am revolted and disgusted in general, and violently outraged most of the time. Waiting is very hard. I know for you, though the worst you may have already gone through. What a crazy world that all that is great and good in America and the cause we serve could have this hideous wrong side to it. Incredible. I find the waiting myself a great strain because nothing has happened yet. I am very sick at heart for you, for G, referring surely to Gail or Gaylord, for Bobby, for etc., trying to avoid indulging in self-pity or being demented by fear. This is such injustice and must be so in the eyes of God, should he exist. But the injustices of this world are myriad, and men are so weak in their efforts to create truth and beauty. Fight, have courage, S. Ultimately, Skip resigned from his position at the embassy, and that ended the investigation. Bobby helped Skip obtain a job with First National Bank of Boston and made arrangements for him to live for a brief while on the third floor of a men's club he was a member of. Bobby also bought a sailboat for Skip. Yet the two men did not sail off into the sunset. Indeed, Bobby sought an ever closer relationship with Skip, but Skip wanted a close physical relationship only with other younger men. The tension became too much for Bobby, and he sought to get away from the agony of unrequited love once again, as he had before in his life, through work. Ike appointed Bobby as the first U.S. executive director of a new organization, the Inter-American Development Bank, in 1959. So, more than a year after he left as National Security Advisor, Ike appointed him as the first executive director, U.S. executive director of the Inter-American Development Bank. Bobby went on to serve as director of the bank under President Kennedy until July 1962. One final image I have to share tonight is a photo of the man who made this book possible, Stephen Benedict. Steve had always maintained his friendship with Bobby and Skip. And after Skip died in 2005, Steve served as executor of his estate. Working through documents at Skip's home in Chelsea, Steve discovered the diary, shown here in the leather carrying case that Bobby had made for it. Now, I've told much of the Bobby Cutler story tonight, but I also have followed the old dictum of authors at public events: don't give away the story, make them go buy the book. How great was Bobby Cutler's contribution to U.S. national security? And did Bobby ever find happiness in a relationship with a man? For answers to those questions and others, I refer you to Ike's Mystery Men. I want to thank the Eisenhower Museum and Library again for having me here today, and I'd be happy to take any questions. We do have a microphone if for anybody who'd like to ask a question.
I'm curious about the pictures of the turn of the century. I mean, the family pictures. How did you, well, who had them? Who saved those?
Well, those pictures actually were initially recuperated by Steve from Skip's house. And Steve then gave the family pictures to the Eisenhower Library.
His baby picture, and he was just 2 or 3 years old.
Yes, even that one. Yeah.
None of the family.
Somehow the family, he was so focused on Skip that he gave everything to Skip. So yeah, all of those. That one, that one, that one, that one. Yep. Yeah. So.
And then how did he get the title of general?
So.
They called him general.
Yes. So during World War, during 1943 and 44, President Roosevelt, who was heading in for his 4th election, believed that it was important for all U.S. soldiers to be able to vote in that election. And Secretary Stimson, a Republican, and Bobby Cutler, a Republican, and other Republicans in the War Department agreed with that. But a lot of Republicans didn't agree with that because they saw it as a ploy to get soldiers, the fighting soldiers, to vote for their commander-in-chief. So they saw in it a plot to ensure FDR's reelection. Meanwhile, Southern Democrats also were not happy with it because they perceived a national ballot would convey a federal right to vote to black citizens who, up until that time, had largely been deprived of the right to vote. So Southern segregationists teamed up with Republicans in the North to fight the bills that were put forward. And Bobby Cutler was made the coordinator for soldier voting, testified in Congress, and ultimately helped a piece of compromise legislation work through. It was a very explosive issue right in the middle of the war. Secretary of War Stimson praised Bobby repeatedly and effusively for his handling of this. And so at the very end of the war, he was promoted to general. But he had never been, commander of armed forces in the field. He was a brigadier general, which I think it conveys. I shouldn't speak to what exactly the term brigadier general means, but he was not a commander of forces in the field. He didn't. It's kind of funny. I mean, throughout his career, people would refer to him as General Cutler, and Ike respected his knowledge of military matters and his ability to manage military matters and national security affairs. But nonetheless, he was not, a commander of forces in the field. So, anyone else? I live in Portsmouth, Rhode Island. I used to be a St. Louis, and I grew up in St. Louis. So that's one reason why I didn't know about my uncle's much about my uncle's life, because he died in 1974 and he lived on the East Coast. So I didn't really know a thing about him when this whole thing was revealed to me on the summer vacation. So. I was trying to remember that. I think my first trip was in 2007, and I love Abilene. It's a fantastic town. It's a beautiful place, and people have been very welcoming. But I think I've made about 5 trips over the years. Yeah. Last time was back in 2017 for the Eisenhower Foundation Gala, at which Steve Benedict spoke, by the way. Steve is amazing. He's 91. He plays tennis twice a week. He is sharp as a tack. It's extraordinary. So I hope he can speak here someday, too, again, on this subject. So.
Is Skip Coons still alive?
Skip Coons is not alive. He died in 2005 after his stint at First National Bank in Boston, where another controversy over homosexuality led to his termination. Bobby found him a job with his friend David Rockefeller at Chase National Bank, and that one held. So Skip went on to a career in international banking with Chase National Bank for something like 20 years, more than 20 years, and ultimately succumbed to emphysema.
Where is that picture now? Who has that picture there?
I actually have that picture because the Eisenhower Library kindly relinquished that to me as a family photo that doesn't really seem to fit with the national security, with the mission of the library, very kindly. However, I must say that after doing all this work, I'm thinking that maybe this appropriate place is actually back with the library, but we'll talk about that some other time. Tim, will you have, yes, sir.
Mr. Shinkle, this is kind of a journey of discovery about a family member. How did you, when you set out, did you plan to write a personal biography primarily, or how did you balance the public life of the man with the personal as the project matured over time?
It's such an interesting question that you ask, because as you gather from my presentation, it's sort of this odd mix of gay rights history and a personal love affair and national security. And when I was going into it, I could see these outlines, but I didn't know which would be the dominant element. And I kind of just went in thinking, I've just got to dig and dig and dig in the facts, find out the facts, and then try to figure out how to tell the story. And what I ultimately decided was that to reflect the whole person, it really needs to be all of those elements, because that's what the story is. That's the truth. You could do a story on Bobby and just the National Security Council. And, he was intimately involved in helping Ike respond to Sputnik. I have a chapter on Sputnik. And he was intimately involved in nuclear arms negotiations with the Soviets. And and nuclear strategy, and had small roles in the coup in Iran and Guatemala, and all of that is fascinating. I think you could do a whole book on just that, but then you'd leave out the other stuff. So I decided, let's see if there's a way to balance it and tell it as a single story. And you can tell me if that succeeded or not. I can tell you it's hard, and it took us a long time to find a publisher, because it's a weird, publishers tend to think in categories. Like, it's either a Cold War history book or it's a gay history book. And this thing kind of brings the two together. But fortunately, we found a press, Steerforth Press, which has been extremely supportive and has done a beautiful job with the book in my mind. So that was pretty much the way it all played out. Mm-hmm. Anyone else? Don't be bashful. No?
I'll just ask one.
Yeah.
So was there a time when any of that sort of intersected his private life and his national security life that you could discern? Was there ever any influence one way or the other?
Many people in the gay community have looked at this story and felt that Bobby's steering of Ike toward the rules as drafted under President Truman that included the phrase sexual perversion, was a betrayal of gay people. That he was a gay man who betrayed all gay men in the federal government. And I don't think that there's enough evidence to say that he, overtly betrayed them. I think it is possible that he was, well, it seems clear that he was trailed by rumors of homosexuality. And that fact of his life may have made him less likely to raise his hand and say, hey, this is not a great thing to do. Let's not do this. That's a place where his personal life may have influenced, but that's speculation. We really don't know that, and it's hard to judge. But beyond that, I don't really see any way in which his sexual orientation influenced the work that he did for Ike or for the nation. I think, and in fact, many of the people I met and have quoted in the book were very convinced or were amazed the extent to which, in a professional setting, he wouldn't reveal anything about his sexual orientation. It was all business all the time. And, but if you spent time socially with him, he would let his guard down a little bit and little cues would slip out. And people would get a hint. Henry Cabot Lodge's son, Harry Lodge, who just died a few years ago, but I interviewed him first in 2007. And he was one of those people who made me realize, oh gosh, there's really a story. He said, he really knocked my socks off. He said, I was so sure that Bobby Cutler was gay that I thought he was an advanced man for the gay rights movement. But that's because he was Harry Lodge's son and had seen Bobby in many social settings and knew Bobby very well. But apart from that, his sexual orientation, I think, played no role in the way he performed his role in the administration. Yes?
So you said that your mother and aunt, who were his nieces, right?
Right.
Knew this and didn't share it until later. So he was never ostracized from his family at all.
Correct.
Even though I'm sure he didn't come out to them, but.
Well, no,
obviously.
Pretty much they all kind of knew. And I was concerned about, number one, the issue of outing my great uncle and betraying his privacy. And I went through a lot of soul searching on that, and ultimately concluded that he, with today's enlightened view of homosexuality, that he would want the story to be told. And if that isn't convincing to you, I rely on the argument that my wife very kindly pointed out to me, which is that Bobby gave the diary to Skip, Skip left it to Steve, and Steve gave it to me. So I have, through that chain of custody, I'm okay to write about it. But you asked about whether Bobby was ostracized by his family, and no, not at all. And virtually all of them seem to know it. I gave a book reading a few weeks ago at the Harvard bookstore in Cambridge, Mass., Bobby's old stomping ground, where all these Cutler brothers went. And all these Cutler cousins came out, including a number that I had never met. And one of the ones I'd never met said, "Oh yeah, we all knew that Bobby was gay. In fact, at my wedding," and this is like a 50-year-old guy, "at my wedding, he came into the hall and went right past the bride and all the bridesmaids and came up and gave me a big kiss." So the family is not surprised by this at all. So, but yeah. All right. Thank you so much.